Okay, so as I was saying, this is a really important turning point, this Battle of Stalingrad, because this means the Soviets are going to start pushing east, which again is going to put more pressure on them, and it's going to open the doors for the Allies to advance other places. Okay, now North Africa, then, like I said, this is where the American allied forces are going to start pushing to expose that soft underbelly of Europe. Okay, so Dwight Eisenhower, who later on is going to become president, he's in charge in the North African Command. The Africa Corps, which was the German forces in North Africa, led by General Erwin Rommel, they're going to surrender May 1943. Again, critical turning point, opening up the jump into Italy. Now, so all summer then in 1943 is going to be spent trying to capture Sicily and then pushing farther up again through Italy. Okay, so again, if you've played some of these World War II video games, you probably, there's a bunch of battles that are fought in Sicily. Monte Cassino is one I know, and Anzio. So those will be important things. There's going to be a bunch of Allied landings that are going to further push the Nazis and eventually, or the Italians, I'm sorry, and eventually the Italians are going to surrender by 1944. Okay, now it's an important note too. Around this time, this is where the Tuskegee Airmen are going to be again African American soldiers or pilots who are going to be fighting in the skies. They'll be fighting and playing a really critical role in the Italian campaign. Again, all segregated unit, but very, very important when it comes to a lot of the battles that they win. All right. So number two, second question: why didn't the Allies attack Germany directly after the United States joined the fight? So that is going to turn then to D-Day. So D-Day is going to be the invasion of Normandy, which is part of France. So it's right here, folks. Okay. So this is a really important thing because again, we've got in the east, we've got the Soviets are pushing the Nazis back. Now we've got this southern front pushing up through Italy. Now we need to reinvade France basically and push the Nazis out. All right. So all through 1943 and 1944, really, we had been planning this invasion. Nobody knew exactly when it was going to happen. There's all kinds of crazy stories about how, like, the United States had all of these, like, fake invasions. They'd have all this radio chatter designed to trick the Germans into thinking that the attack was going to happen, like, the attack was going to happen up here in the Netherlands or over here by Calais or down here. So it was designed basically to just keep the Nazis kind of on their toes because even, a lot of these soldiers had no idea where exactly this invasion was going to happen. And part of it too is just kind of trying to figure out like, okay, where are the Nazis the strongest? Okay. So ultimately they're going to decide on this region of France known as Normandy. The invasion ultimately happens on June 6, 1944. Again, if you've played any video games at all, you know what this is all about. If you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, the opening scene, which is right here, and I'll link to that, that is a critical turning point as well. Again, watch Saving Private Ryan if you hadn't. Another really good series to watch would be Band of Brothers or The Pacific. Talks about the Pacific Theater, but both of those are really, really good programs, or all three of those are really good programs if you're interested in learning about this stuff. But after the D-Day invasion, once the beaches of Normandy are secured, now the Americans and the British and the French, they can start pushing the Nazis back. All right. So Omar Bradley, then, he is going to be an innovator when it comes to basically like changing bombing strategy. Some of it's very similar to what we would have seen in World War or in any of the wars, really, right? You use artillery to open up gaps, but Omar Bradley is going to be very innovative here when it comes to pushing the Nazis back through artillery and air force. Okay. So George Patton down here, he is going to be the leader of the Third Army. By August, Paris will be reached. This is also 1944, an election year. FDR then decides that he is going to run for an unprecedented fourth term, and he will win with Harry S. Truman as his running mate. Okay? So by October then, the Battle of the Bulge is going to happen, which is over in this region in the Ardennes Forest. The Germans are going to push back, but by this time they're suffering. Again, remember the Nazis had multiple fronts here. They had lost very, very heavy losses on the east. They're suffering greatly on the west as well. There's going to be some, pushing back and forth here and there. It's not going to be all, sunshine and roses. But again, by late 1944, the Nazis are on the run. Okay, it's around that time, 1944, when allies in or the Allies are going to start exposing these concentration camps, which is where the Soviets will be the first that will discover what the Nazis had actually been doing when it comes to the final solution. And this is when the rest of the world is really going to know the full extent of what the Nazis were doing to the Jews. There's a scene right here you can watch from the series Band of Brothers, where the concentration camps were discovered by Easy Company, which is portrayed in the series. All right, now by April 1945, then Berlin gets captured by the Soviets, and that's an important thing to keep in mind too. A lot of times we just think about World War II as like, oh, America won this thing, and like, yeah, I mean, obviously without America, things would have been a whole lot different. But we also need to kind of understand that the Soviets really did contribute heavily. They were the first ones actually to cross into Germany, and they will be the ones who capture Berlin. When Hitler's compound, that was my dog sneezing, bless you, Walter. When Hitler's compound gets surrounded, Hitler will commit suicide, and the German Reich then is going to surrender on May 8th, 1945, which becomes known as VE Day forever, or Victory in Europe Day. Now, that means, however, we still have a whole other part of the war to fight, which is that Pacific Theater, and that's an important thing. Now, right before VE Day, FDR is going to die. All right, so he will die in office, meaning Harry Truman will become the new president. Imagine that, right? You're the vice president. You take office in time of war, and then all of a sudden you are thrust into the position, and you have to figure out how to end this war and continue the fighting in the Pacific Theater all at the same time. I do not envy that job. All right, so question number 3 then, what were some significant turning points in the European theater of World War II? All right, now, so let's turn our sights on the Pacific. So in the Pacific then, keep in mind, remember, like December 7th, 1941 and December 8th, we are going to get attacked at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines at the same time. Now, when the Philippines get attacked, General MacArthur, who is in charge of the Philippines forces, he is going to get pushed out. And ultimately, by March 1942, when that final attack was done, MacArthur leaves. And so he is going to leave tons of his troops behind, thousands of them, because he's ordered away by, his boss, the president. And so he is going to say, I'll be back. Don't worry, guys. Now, ultimately, he will return, but it's going to take over a year. And a lot of those troops then that are left behind, they're going to have to participate in what was known as the Bataan Death March, where the Japanese are going to end up killing many, many of these soldiers. And this is a really interesting video, some of the survivors of the Bataan Death March. You should definitely check that out. Okay? Now, we're also trying to figure out how we are going to fight this war. So around this time, April 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle is going to lead what was called the Doolittle Raids on Tokyo, Japan. These were basically suicide missions. There's a video that I'll throw in that Chapter 25 video slideshow. You should check that out because it's really, really interesting. Okay. Now, so by the time 1942 rolls around then, so in May, we're going to fight a really important battle, the Battle of Coral Sea. This is a mostly naval battle, and this is a significant turning point because this is our first success, really, against the Japanese. All right, and then later on, we're going to fight the Battle of Midway, which is at Midway Island, which, if you haven't figured out, is about halfway between North America and Asia. And this is where Admiral Chester Nimitz is going to win, and again, this is going to stop that Japanese advance. We've broken the Japanese codes by this time, so we have a general idea of where they are trying to move their soldiers and their navy. And this is also when we are going to realize that attacking Japan on Japanese mainland is not possible without getting our soldiers in range. Again, if you're going to attack Japan, you're going to need potentially millions of soldiers. How are you going to do that unless you can get close enough where you can resupply? I mean, it's still, even in 1942, it takes forever to get people across the ocean. So this is where we're going to adopt this island hopping strategy, which basically you can kind of see here. We're going to go so here's Pearl Harbor, here's Midway, all right, and then we're going to try to, we go to the Marshall Islands, and then Truk, and then the Solomon Islands, and then the Philippines, and Saipan, and Guam, Okinawa, and ultimately Iwo Jima, right? Island hopping. We get closer and closer and closer until we can finally get close enough where we can launch an attack on Japan proper. Okay. So 1942, then Guadalcanal is going to happen, which is again some brutal, brutal fighting down here. We're going to keep pushing on until we finally capture the Philippines again, or recapture the Philippines in October 1944. MacArthur returns, which is significant. During the Pacific Theater, the Japanese are going to adopt this kamikaze strategy, where they're going to use planes as basically bombs. So they fill them with explosives, and these planes, where the pilots were essentially like locked into the cabin. There weren't any landing gear or anything like that. I mean, these guys, they are suicide mission. They'd throw themselves, or they fly the planes directly into these ships. Not all of them are very successful, but again, this is a new tactic that is going to strike fear in the hearts of Allied naval officers and soldiers. Okay. Now, ultimately, Iwo Jima, which again is right here, this is important. DC trip people, if you remember when we went to the Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C., where you've got that huge bronze statue of raising the flag, that happened at Iwo Jima. Okay. This is critical because if we can capture Iwo Jima, this is close enough where we can actually attack the mainland of Japan. Okay, 6,000 U.S. Marines are going to die. 20,000 Japanese are going to die as well. Only 200 survivors. Many of them are going to commit suicide. There's two other really good movies about Iwo Jima. One is from the American perspective, and then the other is from the Japanese perspective. It's Flags of Our Fathers, and then the other one escapes me, but I'll think of it by the time you watch this on Monday or Tuesday. You should check those out too, because it really talks about how Japanese basically were convinced that Americans were going to kill civilians and do all these horrible things that we didn't do. But so the civilians living on the island are going to kill themselves. They're going to throw their babies off of cliffs because they were convinced that American soldiers were basically going to do terrible, terrible things to the civilians. Now, April 1945, then we capture Okinawa, which again is one step closer. Again, brutal, brutal fighting. Look at the death toll. And now that we are close enough, now the question becomes, what next? If we invade Japan, I mean, Japanese people were convinced that America was like the most brutal regime ever on the planet. And we believe that Japanese civilians were all going to fight to the death. So American military officers were convinced that like an invasion of Japan would take potentially 1.5 million Allied casualties. And that's not even the high end necessarily. And so you're talking millions and millions and millions of soldiers. It might last years. So the big question is, and remember, by April 1945, the war in Europe is basically over, right? So what do we do? Well, remember that Manhattan Project, right? Developing the atomic bomb. We'll talk about that in a second. First, answer number 4. Why did the United States adopt the island hopping strategy in the Pacific? All right, so remember that Manhattan Project. So by July of 1945, we had been testing this atomic bomb. President Truman is made aware of the situation, and so ultimately he is going to basically tell the Japanese emperor that, look, you are going to unconditionally surrender, or we are going to unleash, a hell that you have never even seen and can't even possibly imagine. The Japanese emperor fails to unconditionally surrender. So on August 6th, then, in Hiroshima, Japan, we are going to drop the first atomic bomb, which is Fat Man, it was called. Then we issue the same ultimatum, and we say, all right, again, unconditional surrender. You can get more of what you saw a couple days ago. They don't do it, so 3 days later, we drop another atomic bomb on Nagasaki. These two pictures here, this is Hiroshima, and this is the before, and this is the after. You can see very little is left. I mean, you're talking total devastation, total destruction. 250,000 people, mostly civilians, are going to be killed. This is going to go down as probably one of the toughest decisions that any president has had to make. Do we drop an atomic bomb, knowing full well that it's going to kill all of these civilians? Okay? So I'll leave you with the last question, or number 5 then. Was dropping the atomic bomb the right thing for the United States to do? Why or why not?